Most NBA players are like heroes to a lot of people, but there's certain players that become so hated by certain fans that they become villains of the NBA. A lot of them thrive and love to be in that role, while others end up as villains even though it wasn't intentional. A current player that loves that role is Trey Young, who's the New York Knicks public enemy number one. Clearly they hate him the most because every time he's in New York he torches them, then spends the whole game taunting them about it. He's now become the modern day Reggie Miller, who we'll get to in a bit, but it comes after he almost single-handedly eliminated the Knicks from the playoffs and even got spit on. It's safe to say Trey's a showman and he gets hated around the league because of it, which is just a really weird concept because clearly he idolized Steph Curry growing up and modeled a lot of his game after Steph's. But Curry's a showman too and is the furthest thing away from a villain in the league. In fact, being one of the most universally loved players ever. So it's weird that Trey Young went in the complete opposite route and that was just decided by the fans. NBA fans also decided to turn on Dwight Howard a long time ago, but this one was mostly his fault. On the court for the Orlando Magic, Dwight was always a fan favorite and one of the most respected superstars across all the NBA. But all the hate started back in 2012 when he got Stan Van Gundy fired as head coach, causing a ton of drama in the media and with the team. Then 2 weeks later had back surgery, then demanded a trade in the offseason anyways, so there was no point of getting Stan fired. And the whole thing rubbed fans the wrong way, but then the controversies just never stopped. He formed a super team with Kobe Bryant on the Lakers that flopped because he didn't play like his old self and feuded with Kobe the entire year because of his poor work ethic and having no desire to win games. And considering how Kobe was a fan favorite, it obviously caused the majority of fans to turn on Dwight. And it got even worse when he left the team as a free agent the very next year. He had the same exact problem with James Harden in Houston. Then over the next 5 or 6 seasons, every roster he ended up on hated him, to the point where he said he has no friends in the NBA. And all of the many rumors that have come out about him over the years didn't help either. So very quickly, Dwight became a villain in locker rooms among his peers and with every fan across the league. The love and hate for LeBron James has always been divided, but he's never been more hated, and very few players in league history have been hated as much as he was when he was a member of the Miami Heat. Now, first off, just being as great as he was as a player got him disliked enough. It just comes with the territory. Even Michael Jordan had tons of haters in his Bulls days just because people were tired of him being on top. So there was already that, but on the Cavs, honestly, a lot of people loved him. He was on his own in Cleveland, trying all that he could to bring his hometown team a championship for the first time ever. But then in the 2010 free agency, when he made a complete 180, the fans did too. He was the hero for Cleveland, then left them without telling anyone, joined a super team, and bragged about how good they'd be. He went from trying all he could to win a championship for his team to getting them pretty much guaranteed by joining 2 other superstars. And that's exactly what happened. He won 2 championships and his team dominated the rest of the league for the entire time he was in Miami, was what made the hate he got even worse. Then he eventually did kind of redeem himself by returning to Cleveland. Now Bruce Bowen is a player not as popular as the rest of these guys on this list, but among fans and other players he was without a doubt a villain because back in the early 2000s he was simply one of the dirtiest NBA players of all time. He was known to be a lockdown defender his entire career, but he took it too far and would run under players shooting jump shots and stick his foot underneath jumping players to try and injure them. And this was of course before the rules were as strict about that stuff as they are now. But just being a player that intentionally tries to injure other players really needs no explanation as to why he was considered a villain. I mean, why would you flying rocket kick a dude in the face? That was no accident. And it's just kind of sad because he was such a great on-ball lockdown defender, but it usually gets overshadowed by how dirty he was. Vince Carter today is usually a player that's unanimously loved, but early in his career it wasn't always that way. The first couple of them went great. He won Rookie of the Year, then had that historic dunk contest, and led the Raptors to a bunch of playoff appearances. But after that, in Toronto, things got sour, because after not liking where the team was headed and losing faith in the front office to make things happen, he just flat out stopped trying and started throwing games. So getting upset with that and not liking the head coach, he demanded a trade in 2004. Toronto got a bad deal in return for him, and because of everything, he'd get booed anytime he stepped foot in the Raptors arena. And it didn't help that he would later hit 2 game winners against his former team in their own arena. So how Reggie and Trey are villains of the Knicks, for a long time Vince was that to the Toronto Raptors. And speaking of Reggie Miller, he's always been known to get under other players' skin and say and do whatever it takes to get these guys upset. Plus his dirty tactics on offense don't help his case. But what he'll always be known for is his back and forth with the Knicks. It all started in game 5 of the second round, and Spike Lee and Knicks fans let him know it the whole game. But then the 4th came around, and Reggie hit 3-pointer after 3-pointer, and eventually put up a 25-point 4th quarter, winning the game and giving Spike Lee the infamous choke sign. Then of course his 8 points in 9 seconds came against the Knicks in the playoffs the next year, which tied the game, sent it to overtime. Then the Pacers won that game and the series, which instantly made Reggie Miller public enemy number 1 for them. And speaking of Pacers players that are known villains, there may be none worse than Artest, who was already a dirty player that loved to get into fights, and that gave him the perception of just being a bad dude with an attitude. Then he punched a fan and elbowed James Harden, and that's when he especially became known as a bad guy. I mean, it wasn't like people would boo Meta World Peace or opposing teams just didn't like him, but I think think every NBA fan could agree that he was a little off. He wasn't scared of much, and at times he seemed kinda crazy, and because of this, everyone around the league knew to stay away from the guy that really didn't care about suspensions or fines. But speaking of dirty players, we can combine both Isaiah Thomas and Bill Laimbeer into that category. Now, both were a member of the Bad Boy Pistons, and starting first with Bill, well, he came from a very rich family before he ever made it to the league, which kinda rubbed players the wrong way already when he was coming into a league full of guys who made it there coming from poor families or neighborhoods. But then you combine that with how dirty he would play every chance he got, with hard fouls and cheap shots, then would flop anytime somebody else made contact with him, and it would frustrate fans and players everywhere. And Isaiah Thomas followed that similar trend by playing dirty and even staging the walkout in 1991. The Pistons beat the Bulls 3 straight years in the playoffs, and the one year the Bulls finally overcome them and win, Detroit walks out with a minute left in the game so they don't have to shake their hands. So it just seems like everything the Pistons did was hypocritical and just annoying. Sure, it led them to some success, but they've been known as one of the most hated NBA teams ever since, which was also why the entire 1992 Dream Team pretty much banned Isaiah Thomas from being a part of it when he definitely did deserve a spot. In the past, Jimmy Butler's been known as a villain of the league, and he loved that role. He was one of the players that thrived off of booze, and this is because he can come off as cocky, loves trash talking, getting into it with teammates, and plays with a big chip on his shoulder. He's got a lot of Kobe Bryant tendencies in the way he approaches the game. Now, I can't point to one specific instance as to why he used to be hated, but I know it's all turned around and gone away these past couple of years when he had that whole thing with beating the Wolves starters in practice, publicly accusing them of having no work ethic and not caring about getting better. It was that, his 2020 finals run, and even these past playoffs. I think they all really shed light on the type of player that he is and where he's coming from when he acts a certain way, which really caused fans to change their minds about him. Everyone's also recently shifted their opinions about Kevin Durant, but when he joined the Golden State Warriors, we may not have ever seen a player more hated in NBA history. Not only was he abandoning Russ in free agency, but he joined the already overpowered Warriors and formed the most unstoppable team in the history of the game. It actually did ruin the NBA all those years, and it's obvious why everyone hated him for it. His teammate Kyrie Irving was and still is hated and thought of as a villain in the league, and it all started back in 2017. Before this, he was one of the most loved players, with his flashy play and being the most skilled basketball player and ball handler we've ever seen. Plus, being clutch and the perfect second option to LeBron James, there wasn't a reason to dislike him until he forced his way off the Cavs in 2017, joined the Celtics, played terrible, was a terrible leader, finally joined a good team in the Knicks but refused to do what was necessary to play in games, and single-handedly kinda ruined what could have been one of the best super teams of all time by not playing. And now today he continues to be a liability going forward because teams don't know what they're going to get from him and if he'll even play at all. And all of that combined with him being a flat earther, converting to Islam out of the blue, saying he's going to retire in 3 years, and being a supporter of multiple conspiracy theories have just made a lot of fans done with everything to do with him. Kevin Garnett has never been thought of as a nice guy because he's infamously been known as not only one of the biggest trash talkers in NBA history, but one of the guys that always takes it way too far and would often get into fights because of it. And even though he was 6'11", he didn't mind bullying smaller players. Like the time he got into a yelling match with Jose Calderon, then played full court defense on him and clapped in his face the whole way down the court. He was pretty hated among NBA players too because most of them found themselves on the wrong end of his trash talk. Then finally there's Kobe Bryant, who now has really universally been loved these past 2 years since everything happened, and the hate towards him did fade away more towards the end of his career, but during it, especially in those Shaq years and in his prime, he'd get highly criticized on a nightly basis for being a ball hog, too overconfident, a jerk to his teammates, and not passing the ball when he probably should have, making him known as an extremely selfish player. He was a player people loved to hate, and he knew he was hated. Personally, Kobe was always my favorite player growing up, and even though I accepted that he was a ball hog, it made a lot more sense later on when I'd hear him do interviews. Listen, Kobe should have passed the ball more, I think we can all agree on that, but to hear him say, I show up to the gym 3 hours before practice, working on my game and my shot, and some guys walk in 15 minutes late and wonder why I don't pass them the ball. Who would you want to shoot the last shot? The guy that shot 10,000 shots this week, or the guy who put up a couple hundred? And from that point on, I had a completely new respect for Kobe Bryant, because it makes sense and it worked out pretty well too. Like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed. I'm out.